Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for A Woman's Place, History Through Today, a roundtable discussion presented by the Political and Civic Engagement, or PACE, program in the IU Arts and Humanities Council. Today, we're featuring 5 impressive IU students involved in research, activism, and professional experiences all pertaining to suffrage, voting, and civic life. Today's panel is the first in a series of discussions, pop-up exhibits, and public events at IU Bloomington, exploring the complex history and legacy of the suffrage movement as we celebrate the 19th Amendment centennial. I invite you to learn more about these events at go.iu.edu/19A. That link will also be posted in the comments for you. First, each panelist today will talk about their experiences for 5 minutes. Then we'll have a discussion with our remaining time. I asked our panelists to all start their presentation with an object or artifact, whether it be physical or digital, as a jumping off point for their research and experiences. In order, Lauren Schumacher, Sam Bowden, Lucy Newell, Alma Amzat, and Cassidy McCammon will be presenting today. So let's get started. First up is Lauren Schumacher. Lauren is a senior majoring in history and anthropology with specific interests in historical archaeology and 19th century American history. She is from Columbus, Indiana, and plans to pursue a PhD in archaeology following graduation with the intent to work in museum curation and artifact conservation. As part of the History Honors Program, she researched women's pockets in the 19th century and how they were used by suffragettes as symbols of economic, social, and political power and equality. Welcome, Lauren.
Hey, thanks. So to start, I think I'll introduce what pockets were in pre-19th century America. So if you could share that image of the pocket. Great, okay, so these are what pockets were for women in about the 17th and 18th centuries. They were large bags that would be tied around the waist between your petticoat and your outer skirt. So they were very private, and they would contain a lot of things we don't really think about women using in today. They'd be used to carry wares, coins, stuff for women to really engage in a domestic and an economic sphere. So pockets kind of disappear at the turn of the 19th century. Before the 19th century, you think of the silhouette of the dresses have a very large hip. But then as we move into the Regency, we get the empire waistline. So the waistline moves from your true waist to just below your bust. And when that happens, you can't access your pockets right at your waist anymore. So pockets just kind of disappear because they wouldn't look very proper with the kind of column of the Regency dress. So pockets are lost, and women immediately start talking about it. They said the whole world was divided into pocketists and anti-pocketists at this time. So essentially, middle-class women were forced to choose between fashion and practicality, or kind of class conformity or domestic independence. So throughout the 19th century, women are talking about this subject. But we see specifically, as we move into the suffrage movement, women are outwardly expressing pockets as objects of privacy, as financial independence, as social independence, and also using them as an allegory for the vote. So I'll kind of talk about each of those 3 areas real quick. Within privacy, again, like I said, they were in a very intimate area. They were very private. You could hold a lot of things in there that people wouldn't know about. We have records of people hiding money in their pockets, and their husbands don't know about it until they die, and then they get their pockets and they're like, oh, there's a ton of money in here I didn't know about. So they were kind of a very private place, close to the body. They couldn't be easily accessed or stolen or looked at by the public. So that was kind of a way that women were able to maintain agency and, kind of operate in their everyday life. So again, with finance, like I said, people could hold money that people didn't know about. And this all kind of plays into the property rights of the time. So at the time, all property, including a woman's earnings, all belonged to her husband. Property is state mandated, and there was no property laws that were ever federally mandated. So this was a way for women to keep property to themselves and to only show people what they had when they wanted it. It's kind of different from a handbag in that when you have a bag, everyone can kind of see what could be contained in it, and you have to constantly bring things in and out. Whereas a pocket, you can just feel what's in your pockets, and that kind of gives a different sense of independence and agency that handbags don't have. Let's see, social independence then. So women, without pockets, you're kind of forced to rely on men, or more specifically men's pockets, in order to operate outside of your home. Because if you can't carry your own money, if you can't carry your own stuff to operate in this kind of middle-class social sphere, you're not independent. You have to rely on your husband to carry your money so that you can go make purchases that he would have to know about. It's not stuff that you can do for yourself by yourself. And so we see a lot of really interesting articles come out, both from suffragettes and also from men who are opposing women's pockets at the time. And kind of the rhetoric is that men think that they have pockets either due to their superiority, or the pockets are kind of what is aiding their superiority. Of course, suffragettes think that, it's the pockets that are the problem, and that we should give women pockets as well. So you see suffragettes using it as an allegory for the vote pretty frequently. So because they represent things, pockets represent things that the vote represents, like financial security, social independence, they start to kind of use the two interchangeably. So we have this really good satirical poem that comes out that I used for the basis of a lot of my research by Alice Duer Miller in 1914. And she uses pockets as a direct allegory for the vote, but the things that she's saying about pockets are also very true. So she says a few things like, why we oppose pockets for women, because pockets are not a natural right, and because the great majority of women don't want pockets. If they did, they would have them. So it's a lot of these really funny sayings, but it's stuff that was very true, both about the vote and about the pockets themselves, because they were both kind of representing the same things in this era. And so besides that, suffragettes are also just explicitly stating that pockets are symbols of progress and independence, and that they're being denied these solely on the basis of their sex. So as they're saying that about pockets, they're clearly also saying this about the vote, and that they need both of them at this point. And then I think I would like to end on one of my favorite quotes that I found in my research. I think this was written in about 1900, and it was written by a suffragette writer. It says, "Until woman consents to have as many pockets as man, to have pockets that will hold something and which she can reach without permanent injury to her spine, her acquisition of political equality and the right of suffrage will amount to nothing. She will continue to be a vassal, not a peer, and utterly unequal to holding her own with the creature of pockets and pants." So yeah, that was pretty much my research. It was very interesting. I had a lot of fun doing it, and I hope you guys enjoy.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I will never take my pockets for granted again. Our next panelist is Sam Bowden. Sam is a senior studying history and cinema studies with minors in Spanish and international studies. As a part of the Hutton Honors College, he plans to complete a senior honors paper in history this fall. After undergrad, he hopes to attend graduate school for a master's degree in history. At IU, he's participated in Ashton student government and served as the research assistant for the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society. Welcome, Sam.
Hi, thanks for having me. So yeah, I was in the history honors program with Lauren, and this paper was written for that class. You can go ahead and share my slides if you'd like. So my paper ended up being titled A Social History of the Deviant Suffragette, and it was a social history almost as much as it was linguistic history. I ended up looking at that term suffragette as like the sole focus of my research, because words have very complex lives in history, as we know. They change all the time. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, so this object, clipping from a newspaper, really like altered the way that I was looking at my research. When I was going into it, I was kind of thinking too much in like binaries of that there were going to be women who were pro-suffrage and men who were anti-suffrage for their distinct political reasons. But I saw this little section in a newspaper, The Battle for Suffrage, and on the left we have a pro-suffrage woman, and on the right we have a anti-suffrage woman, which surprisingly there were a large amount of women who were opposed to suffrage. And you can see from this newspaper that oftentimes they were given like equal column inches in the newspapers to voice their opinions. Like it's kind of very similar to the polarized politics of today, where like different sides are given like kind of equal representation in terms of, or in the pursuit of being like unbiased. You can go to the next slide. So after a lot of research, my thesis for my paper ended up being that the concept of the suffragette and the women's suffrage movement was used by actors on both sides of the suffrage debate to represent a deviation from the established norms for women's behavior. Through my research, I looked at a lot of cartoons and satirical articles and stuff like that, read a lot of books, and I realized that this word suffragette was being used to kind of divide people in a way. So the people who were opposed to suffrage would frame these suffragettes as just kind of like nasty women, basically, like that these were the women who were socialists, and they were usually like sexually deviant in ways. But then also on the other side of the coin, even pro-suffrage women were divisive in their inclusion of like lower class women or women of color, obviously. So they're kind of, it was like a polarizing thing on both sides. So I kind of just wanted to talk about the process of my research, because I feel like no matter how many times I do it, research ends up being pretty hard. Like you can be as experienced as you can be and be 4 years into a degree doing research all the time, but it still never seems to be much easier for me. So I think the first thing that's really important for any research I do is to remove my own biases and preconceptions, because I always go into research like thinking I'm going to say a specific thing. And I feel like especially this group can agree that when we go into research about women, we bring our like preconceived notions, our like feminist frameworks, which is fine, but like we need to also like in the pursuit of academia, like be as unbiased as we possibly can, obviously. So I think the first step to doing that is just to like consume as many resources as we can. So like just keep making those searches, and by troubleshooting, I mean just like altering, like using like quotation marks in JSTOR and using advanced searches, and just like saving everything you come across, even if it's kind of unrelated, because it might lead to your big idea at a later point. And then putting it all together, I think for this paper specifically, I had so many like disparate thoughts and concepts, and they were all kind of just like scrambled in my brain. But as long as you keep like build a knowledge on this particular background and keep going, like eventually you'll have a paper that is pretty good. Yeah, so you can stop sharing my screen if you want. Yeah, so I had a really good experience. I loved learning all of the stuff that I learned, and I feel like especially having people in my class who could help me out, like Lauren, who might have a resource because we were researching very similar things, was really nice. And yeah, I hope to do a lot of research in the future on women's history and suffrage.
Hi, I'm Lucy. I think Anna had to pop out of the meeting really quick, so I will just go ahead and start. But I have two experiences I wanted to talk about a little bit, just to kind of update everybody on what my knowledge of suffrage as well as voting issues in general is. So I currently serve as the co-president of Women in Government at IU, which is a club that works to engage with women who are interested in pursuing careers in government. And this year, we as an organization have learned a lot about suffrage because you know, it's the 100-year anniversary of the women's right to vote. And so we wanted to celebrate that. But then we kind of ran into a lot of pushback or, you know, different opinions on how to do that in a respectful and positive way. And so with that, it led our organization to, I guess, you know, host events and discussions where we could talk about what suffrage means and why it's such an intersectional issue, because we were finding that so often many groups of people were left out of the fight for suffrage, or their stories aren't told as much. So as an organization, we've really worked to engage with that and educate each other. But so that's just one way I've engaged with the issue of suffrage. But more importantly, or not more importantly, but I guess why I'm on the panel is because this past summer, I have been an intern at an organization called Common Cause Indiana. And if you want to pull up the article that I brought, so I've been an intern at an organization called Common Cause Indiana. And for those of you who might not know what Common Cause is, it's an organization that works to fight modern day voting suppression in whatever form it looks like. Oftentimes that is, I mean, I guess like the most important issue that Common Cause fights is gerrymandering and the way that that affects our elections. But this year, for those of you who've been following the election, it has been voting by mail and what that looks like and how that impacts people and their right to vote. So this article was just from about a few weeks ago from the Washington Post. Basically, the Postal Service has been warning people that their votes can totally be disenfranchised because mail-in ballots are constantly denied, and a lot of times for really no good reason. And I guess just a little background on my engagement with this specific issue of disenfranchisement with mail-in ballots. Over the summer, I worked with Common Cause on a lawsuit in which Common Cause is joining together with other organizations that work towards voter protection in our area to sue the state because in Marion County alone, so central Indiana, 1,700 absentee ballots that were delivered on time were rejected for really no reason. And so the nature of my work this summer was kind of tedious, but it was a lot of going through each individual ballot and looking at why they were maybe denied and a large portion of these ballots were denied for really no reason at all. They were postmarked on time, they were in possession of the state on time, and still for some reason they were denied. So I guess what Common Cause is doing now is looking at how voting by mail impacts, people from all different areas of life and how that's going to impact their vote in this upcoming election. So that's been really interesting, and I've learned so much through this process on how elections work and what it means to mail in a ballot or vote absentee. And I guess what I think is so interesting is that it shows how from all the way from many, many years ago when women were fighting for the right to vote up to now, voter suppression looks different no matter what, and it is still very present despite the fact that women were enfranchised and various different groups have gained that right to vote. We still see voter suppression in every single election in every single state, so it's important to continue that fight even today. So I guess that's all I have about my experience, but yeah.
Thanks for shedding light on this important issue, Lucy, and I'm sorry for blinking out for a little bit there. My Wi-Fi went out on me. Great. Our next guest is Alma Amzat. Alma is a PACE senior passionate about engaging the public to promote government efficiency. She has worked as a legislative intern at the Indiana State House of Representatives, where she had the opportunity to interact with the Women's Caucus. After graduation, Alma hopes to enroll as a community economic development facilitator in the Peace Corps before proceeding to graduate school. Thanks for joining us, Alma.
Hi, Lucy, and hi, everyone on the call. I just called you Lucy. Hi, Anna. Hi, all. My name is Alma Amzat, and I'm a senior with the O'Neill School, and I'm studying law and public policy. But as Anna just said, I'm also working towards a PACE certificate. As a freshman, I took the Women's Place in Society course with PACE director Lisa Marie Napoli. This was a 3-week seminar course with IFS, if you're familiar with that. And it was my first introduction to suffrage and knowing my role as a woman in public policy. After that class, I continued to expand on my research by focusing on the Equal Right Amendment and the struggle to secure women's place in society. Just talking about what I'm going to talk about on this panel, which is really women's place in Indiana state government. Last year, I moved to Indianapolis for a semester where I interned with the Indiana State House of Representatives. This picture was with my supervisor, Andrea, and it was taking on the last day of my internship. Bringing this experience back to my topic of women's place in Indiana state government, I thought it was important to note that I was one of about 7 women in my internship cohort, and the other 23 were men. But this was the complete opposite with the full-time staff and intern classes from previous years. There were usually more women than men, or at least a closer proportion. My internship was with the Republican caucus, and as at 2019, the legislative session for 2019, there were 10 female representatives and 10 male representatives, and 61 male representatives. So that's a really big difference. It's like 1 in 10 people were women. I also had 4 representatives on my caseload, and all 4 of them were male. But my experience with learning women's place in Indiana state government was driven through my supervisor. She was an assistant on the Women's Caucus. She helped, just like every other mini caucus, like the Black Caucus or the Democrat Caucus and all of that. They met frequently to strategize on issues that were important to them in their work that they did at the State House, and also to women of Indiana. They introduced some legislation like House Bill 1394, which established the Indiana Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission, and it promoted activities to celebrate the passage of the 19th Amendment. So that was planning for 2020. And then there were also several resolutions. Resolutions are kind of like recognitions for things that go on in the state. There were resolutions that were introduced and or passed to celebrate women in Indiana. Some of them was one that celebrated International Women's Day. It recognized the essential role of women in history during Women's History Month. Another one was to congratulate the Speedway High School girls softball team. So it's not just about women in government, but everything that women do around the state was being recognized. Something to celebrate, a couple weeks ago, the House Democrats celebrated their first female majority in Indiana, where they had 17 female representatives out of 33 in the House Democrat caucus. I have hope that someday soon women will feel more comfortable taking on roles in Indiana state government. This doesn't just mean having a woman governor or more female senators and representatives, but also more female legislative interns and assistants and lobbyists, and even visitors to the state house. I encourage everyone to apply to the congressional internship or policy internship or advocacy internship, because this is one important way to have our voices heard and to promote diversity. Thank you.
Sorry, one moment. Thank you so much, Alma. I'm so glad you've made an impact on the state level. That was just really cool to hear. Our final panelist before we move to the discussion part of the program is Cassidy McCammon. Cassidy is a junior at IU studying political science and management. She is active in the political and civic engagement department on a variety of projects, including the Big Ten voting challenge and suffrage centennial activities, which she will be talking about today. In her free time, Cassidy enjoys reading and writing. Welcome, Cassidy.
Hi, hello everyone, and thank you, Anna, for the lovely introduction. I am so excited to be speaking with all of you today. For the last month, I've been leading a book club over We Must Be Fearless, the women's suffrage movement in Indiana by Anita Morgan. It was the first time I've ever been in a book club, let alone led one, and it was actually the first time I've read a whole book about suffrage, so this month was full of learning moments for me. One of the biggest things I've come to realize since reading this book was how intertwined suffrage is with so many other political issues. I really shouldn't have been surprised. I think about today and how it's impossible to discuss one political issue without drifting through multiple topics. However, I'm not a history major, and I've come to realize that so many of the nuances and interconnectedness of events can be lost when trying to summarize history, which is why it's always so interesting to learn beyond what we're taught in a basic high school curriculum. Anita Morgan herself, the author, will be speaking at the Equality Day event this Wednesday. I'll share more details about that later, but please keep in mind that she'll be here to share more details about the specific women and their stories. But today, I'd like to give you a brief overview of events in Indiana's history and what struck me during the book club, and then I'll bring you up to speed on what IU is doing to advance voter rights today. If you could cue the slides, that would be great. And then next slide, please. Indiana actually has one of the oldest suffrage organizations in the nation. The first meeting for women's suffrage rights was in 1851, almost an entire 70 years before the 19th Amendment was ratified. At this meeting, these women came up with a series of demands, a few of which are included on this slide. Right from the start, these women were concerned with so much more than just the vote, but they saw voting as their opportunity to make further change on the issues that they cared about. Many of these women were staunch abolitionists, and during the Civil War, Indiana women threw all of their efforts into war work, hoping that it would prove to the male legislators that women were worthy of the vote. Unfortunately, women were not included in the 14th Amendment, but this didn't discourage Hoosier women. Through organizational troubles and years of weak leadership, through conflicts and personal quarrels, they kept fighting for women's rights. Next slide, please. There were many reasons why people didn't support women's suffrage. These reasons ranged from claiming that women didn't want the vote to stating that if women entered politics, they would lose their physical beauty. Suffrage organizations were able to refute most of these claims, but one of the biggest persisting reasonings for anti-suffrage was the temperance movement, which was fighting for the prohibition of alcohol. Not all suffragists were supporters of the temperance movement and vice versa, but there was enough of a crossover for the two issues to be associated by the public. This meant that many businesses who sold and produced alcohol gave a lot of time and money to anti-suffrage efforts, and many legislators didn't want to pass suffrage-related bills because they thought it would lead to prohibition. Despite these setbacks, there were moments of progress in women's rights, such as passing legislation to increase women's property rights and more women being accepted into higher education and into fields such as medicine and journalism. However, the landmark victory that we're celebrating today didn't come until much later. Next slide, please. Skipping forward to World War I, women around the country yet again threw themselves into war work, but this time they didn't give up the fight for the vote like they had done during the Civil War. And it worked. After the war was over, many legislators cited the dedication to the country that women had shown as proof that women deserved the right to vote. The 19th Amendment was officially ratified on August 26, 1920. It was a long battle, and while Hoosier women celebrated their new right to vote, there was still so much work to be done regarding women's rights, especially for women of color. Next slide, please. Since I've been a student at IU, I've been so lucky to be a part of the political and civic engagement program. One of their big efforts this year is the Big Ten Voting Challenge, which is a nonpartisan organization that strives to increase voter registration and turnout among students on campus. Right now, the Big Ten Voting Challenge is working with a variety of organizations in order to actively engage minority groups that can often be left out when discussing politics. Over the next few months, the Big Ten Voting Challenge will be making an appearance at events, both in person and virtual, working with many student groups on campus, and even working with athletics to spread educational materials as far as possible. Voting is such an important way to make sure that your voice is heard. Our goal is to go beyond the group of students who are already politically active and bring many more people into the conversation. Obviously, there was so much more, both in Morgan's book and related to the Big Ten Voting Challenge, that I wish I had the time to speak with you about today. If you're interested in learning more about the suffrage movement in Indiana, I would highly recommend that you attend Equality Day, the event this Wednesday, either virtually or in Alumni Hall. Anita Morgan herself will be speaking at 5 p.m. with a suffrage-related documentary showing at 7 p.m. If you'd like to get involved with the Big Ten Voting Challenge, you can visit the website or you can contact me directly, and that information is on the slide. If you could stop sharing, please. As my parting words, I'd like to ask a small request. When you're voting this November, please keep in mind that state and local elections are just as important as national ones. The right governor, the right representative in the state house, even the right members of a school board can make a world of difference in the issues that you're fighting for. It did for the Indiana suffragists. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cassidy. It's awesome to learn that Hoosier women fought for suffrage early on in the movement. So yeah, go Hoosiers. So now we'll proceed with our discussion. And I think I'm starting to see everyone's videos come back on. So we should be good to go. Yes. Okay, I'm gonna wait one more moment. Great, I think I see everyone. Yes. Okay, so to kick off the discussion, my first question is this. What do you think people don't know but should about suffrage? Lucy?
I think definitely for me, one thing that's so important to understand is how intersectional of an issue it is. I think that a lot of times women's movements throughout history have kind of went by the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats, but then they lift at expense of who? Like almost like white women could get their foot in the door, and so then they exclude women of color or LGBTQ women. That happened in the 70s with the equal rights movement. It happened in the 20s with the suffrage movement. So I think that one thing that's so important that people remember is that voting and suffrage in general is such an intersectional issue, and there are a lot of voices and stories to be told that aren't necessarily listened to from women who aren't necessarily credited with suffrage in general.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this?
Sure, I was just gonna,
Sorry. Yeah, I totally agree with everything that Lucy said. And I also feel like the vote is like almost as much symbolic as it is like an actual like process, because people can be enfranchised, but they can also feel like their access to the vote is diminished. Like as we saw like in the primary elections this year with all of these polling places getting shut down in the middle of like the first peak of the pandemic, and especially like in areas where like in Louisville, they only had one polling station for several districts, and it was just like a mess. And so people, like working class people who had to like run from their jobs to go vote, were pretty much prohibited from the vote, and their voice wasn't heard. So yeah, there's like suffrage, but then there's also like access to the vote.
Definitely. Alma?
Yeah, I was going to talk about Victoria Woodhall. Not many people know about her. She was the first woman to appear on the presidential ballot, and this was nearly 50 years before women got the right to vote. I think this should be an inspiration to us all to not be afraid to get involved in the political process, even when it's not the status quo and the norm. As a woman, you're an equal contributor to society, and you have the power to be the change that you want.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Yeah, I wasn't aware of her before, so thank you. Cassidy or Lauren, would you like to say anything? We could also move on to another question if you'd rather.
Yeah, this question made me think of a quote in the book where a woman was fighting for a specific issue that she cared about, and she brought a petition of 1,000 signatures, all from women, to her representative. This was before women could vote. So the representative told her that this petition would mean the same thing if it were signed by 1,000 mice. Because, I mean, women couldn't vote then, so the representative said, you aren't my constituents, I don't have to represent you. And I think that is especially important today. If you are in an area where voting access is significantly harder to get, or you're one of the groups that is usually disenfranchised by voting, your representative knows that and is not as likely to listen to the issues that you care about. So voting access is huge. Absolutely. It's definitely something that we should continue fighting for.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great. Thank you. And also just a very sad example. I'm sad to hear that, but we can use that as motivation moving forward. Lauren, do you want to answer that question, or should we move?
Yeah, okay. I can answer it. I think, yeah, kind of like going off of what Lucy said, I think it doesn't stop with just the vote. You know, voting is important, and we need to do that in order to enact some change, but it's also what other issues can we address with our votes. And I think we could all work on and help other disenfranchised communities.
Yeah, most definitely. So my next question kind of has to deal with something that Sam touched on a little bit. How does and did voting empower women in their lives outside of civic participation? Or if we're going to put it differently, how is voting symbolic of agency elsewhere in one's life?
I can take it. Yeah, I think at least from my research, stuff that is, the vote is symbolic within their personal lives is a lot of marital politics, and it's stuff where you can gain independence from your husband in a very different way, where, your vote is confidential. It's something that only belongs to you, that only you can enact, and it's a very personal form of agency that I think a lot of people kind of forget about, especially in this day and age where I think people are very vocal about their political opinions, and it's all over social media, and it's great to express those opinions, but it's also something that you can keep very private if you choose to do so, especially with the suffrage movement, where you're talking a lot of kind of tough gender politics and stuff that wasn't really talked openly about. I think it was a really good way to express your political opinions without necessarily feeling the backlash that you would feel if you just expressed them out loud in your home. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Anyone else want to take a stab at that?
Sure, I could talk a little bit about it. I really like the quote that Cassidy talked about, or the thing she talked about with the rats and the mice, and being equal in that sense. So if society sees that your voice is equal to a rat when it comes to something as important as voting, then you don't matter in other things. So I think having the right to vote just lets everyone know that we're equal, we're the same. You're not better than me in any way. Our voices matter equally. And if they matter in that way, then they matter in shopping and whatever it is that I do in being in school. I'm equal to you. And I think that's what it just empowers you in that way.
Most definitely. Thank you. Go ahead, Luke.
Sorry. One way that I think that voting really empowers women is, since 2018 since the 2016 election, we've seen so many women not only vote, but run for office, and knowing that they have this this support system of other women who are looking to elect women or looking to elect people that have maybe experienced the same thing as them is extremely empowering. I at least know for me, when I go to the polls and I'm able to cast a ballot for a woman, I think that's so exciting. Not to play identity politics, but it's a very exciting thing to see. And it also shows what Cassidy mentioned, that elections from the bottom to the top matter. Like seeing more women on your school board, or seeing more women in your Indiana State House, like how Alma mentioned, there are a majority women representing Democrats in the Indiana State House. I think the ability to see that increased diversity and representation is very empowering for women voters.
Great, thank you. Right. We can move on as well. I have plenty of questions. Great. So this question has a bit of a preface to it. So as you all know and have mentioned in your presentations, the history of women's suffrage in the United States is not a rose-colored story. In the New York Times, Brent Staples wrote in an article titled "How the Suffrage Movement Portrayed Black Women" that historians are rightly warning groups involved in suffrage commemorations, such as us, not to overstate the significance of the 19th Amendment. It covered the needs of middle-class white women very nicely, but it meant very little to Black women in the South, where most lived at the time and where election officials were well practiced in the art of obstructing Black access to the vote, or to the ballot box, excuse me. As African-American women streamed in to register, Southern officials merely stepped up the level of fraud and intimidation. So my question is this, and I know that this is a big one, but how can we keep people from being left out of voting in the future? What steps can we take to make sure that everyone is able to be represented?
I can go. I think just education is huge. If you know the process of the dates that you need to register by, if you do things ahead of time, you're very well versed in the nuances and the things that can invalidate your ballot. Education can go a long way to making sure that your vote isn't invalidated. That can be huge. Knowing what are some things that people are going to try to do to invalidate your vote, just knowing that so you can kind of think ahead, that's huge. That can prevent a whole lot of groups that are usually marginalized to be able to speak their opinions.
Lucy?
So one thing I think is very important is education, obviously, and then also with every piece of legislation or rule that is passed around elections, I think that legislators and people and voters need to ask the question, who does this impact and how? Because you see, vote by mail, the homeless community doesn't have an address where they can address their ballot to, or some people don't necessarily have IDs when they go to vote in person, and so that disenfranchises a lot of Indiana voters. And people who live on Native American reservations might not be able to vote from their address. So with certain pieces of legislation or voting rules that are passed, to somebody it might seem oh, that's no big deal. That doesn't seem like a barrier at all. But for a lot of people, that's a make or break on whether or not they vote at all. And so I think we really need to ask those questions to make sure it's not going to be disenfranchising people before you establish a rule.
Most definitely. I read a really interesting article a few weeks ago about how in Ohio during the primaries, the Ohio Secretary of State office and the Ohio Grocers Association actually partnered to hand out absentee voting registration forms in grocery stores, just because like if all public libraries are closed and a lot of people don't have printers at home, how are you supposed to register to get access to the tools you need to submit a form to vote absentee? So yeah, it's definitely things like that we need to take into consideration. Sam?
Yeah, I think also along with that, I don't think it's that radical of an idea to declare Election Day a national holiday, especially for working class people. And also they're obviously disenfranchised people such as like, I think most states don't allow prisoners to vote or people who have been previously felons. So there's a lot of, there are just barriers at every corner.
Alma?
So I was just going to talk about making it more easy, accessible, and straightforward, because like everyone's talked about, there's so many things that hit you at every corner. But even as students, we have a responsibility to vote. We're not being excluded in any way, but we still don't vote. So voting and making sure that you encourage people around you, not just students, but your family members to vote. And even you being honest about your voting and being educated on your vote. So you're not just voting to vote, but you're actually voting for the interest of the country.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Okay. I'll move on to my next question unless anyone wants to say anything else. So it's tempting to think of the women's suffrage movement, not so much after you all presented today, but it is tempting to think of the women's suffrage movement as a monolithic thing that doesn't really have a lot of different facets to it. But how can learning about its discrete local movements and subcultures make our understanding of suffrage richer and more complex?
Start off as well. So before the 19th Amendment was ratified, it was really a state-by-state basis as to which women could vote and what they could vote on. As states in the West started to gain state status, they automatically included women in their voting. So most of the states in the West had voting decades before the 19th Amendment was ratified. And then some states had what they called partial suffrage, which is where women could vote on like school board elections and local things like that, but couldn't vote in certain elections like governor, president, etc. So the suffrage movement cited successes in other areas as reasons why they should be able to vote in their state as well. Like Wyoming was I believe one of the first states to include women's suffrage. And so suffragists in Indiana were saying, hey, look at Wyoming. Everything's going just fine over there. Why can't we do it here? We're all American women. Why are they allowed to vote but we aren't? So definitely small local victories helped other victories in other areas.
Alma?
A really big thing for me in everything that I do, like policy-wise, is the cultural impact of life on those policies. So I think it was definitely not monolithic at all. It took over seven decades to get the vote passed. Cultures changed, the movement adapted with that. And I think it's important to know even today, like movements you're trying to start today, things are gonna change. Different states have different policies, different cultures have different beliefs. And even though we have the same end goal, we all want like a good, fair society, we're gonna disagree on certain things, and that disagreement is important. That tension is important to get to an efficient end, if it's possible.
Definitely. Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think that I totally agree that it's not monolithic and that the vote just like it transcends like the categorization of just like political history. It's like social, it's cultural, it's it even goes into like the domestic sphere, how like family relations work. And I feel like in general, the suffrage movement, we can learn a lot from it because it's kind of it's kind of a parallel with what's going on today, like the way that movements work and that they're divisive. We can apply what we learn from studying that history to our political lives now.
Definitely. Historical context is always a good thing. All right, Lauren, would you like to answer this question?
Yeah, I know, I think something that was helpful for me, learning about, how it's not a monolith, is the conflicts that were happening within the movement between women about their own suffrage and about which other women should be allowed that suffrage and kind of how to go about that. It's something I don't think I was ever taught in school. It's just kind of like all women wanted the vote, period. Like, it was kind of nice to hear from some other voices and things. I know personally there was one bit of my research that I loved the story, but then when you kind of think about it, it's it's a little sad. It was in a meeting. The leader of this meeting said that she had seen a purse left on the ground, and she was so pro-pocket that she said, "I tell all of our ushers to just put all the money in the offering, like in the box for donations from any purses that are left, because clearly if a woman's carrying a purse, she doesn't care about herself and she doesn't care about her independence." And it's a funny story, but then you think about it and it's like, well, that woman probably also would like to vote if she attended your meeting. Maybe we should think about some other issues that are at play, and getting votes for all women and support from all women, not just what you think women should be independent for.
Yeah, definitely. It's super interesting just to think about the internal conflicts that happen within like groups as they're trying to, advocate for social progress and equality. So yeah, thank you. Let's see. All right, anything else on that question before we move on? Cool. Okay, so this is a very current question. So what does it mean to see Kamala Harris's name on the Democratic ticket as the Democratic vice presidential nominee this election? Go ahead, Lucy.
So I think that this is exciting on so many levels. First of all, it just shows that women are fit for high office. I mean, that's something that a lot of us know, but that's also something that a lot of people don't know and need to be taught. So showing that, women are qualified, there are options to fill the cabinet with women and to fill the vice presidency with women, and eventually the president will be a woman, I'm sure. So to see that representation, I think is really empowering I want to have a career in government, and to see a woman in that high of an office, hopefully, or whatever is to come of it. Still her making the ticket is history, but ideally she'd be the vice president. And to see her in a high office just shows that women are fit for those roles and positions. So I think not only is it empowering, but it's just, very inspiring for young girls, for women our age, for people who might not, look like what a typical politician looks like, to know that their voice and representation is extremely important to the function of our government.
Definitely. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll echo the same sentiments as Lucy. Representation matters, and I think it's especially important that 100 years after the 19th Amendment was ratified, we see a woman as the vice president nominee on the Democratic ticket. I think that's very special and exciting, and I'm very excited for November.
Awesome.
Yeah, I also agree that her nomination is historic, and it's especially really heartwarming to see how people of South Asian or African American descent are seeing themselves represented by her nomination. But then also at the same time, I do know that some people are a little bit disappointed in her nomination because of different political reasons, especially in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and her her history as the district attorney. But yeah, so it's both symbolic, but then you can get into like her personal politics as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think it is important to acknowledge that, like, in this moment in particular, when like social media and public discourse so often flattens like nuance and eliminates it, like it's important to recognize that people can be nuanced and complex, and like just you can't just like them or dislike them, then that's the end of it. Anyone else? Okay. So we are actually sadly coming to the end of our time together, but we do have time for one final question that I'll ask our panelists to ruminate on while I go through some closing announcements. The question is this: how would you like to see people taking action moving forward in regard to voting and suffrage? So think on that for a few moments. And while they're doing that, in addition to thanking our panelists for taking time out of the first day of classes this semester to share their wisdom and insights with us, I also want to thank our partners who made this event possible: the Department of History, Women in Government, and the campus-wide commemorations of the 19th Amendment Centennial sponsored by the Arts and Humanities Council, PACE, the Mester, and the Office of the Provost and Executive Vice President. Please check out the other events and pop-up exhibits at the URL go.iu.edu/19A. That is also in the comments if you missed it. So, panelists, are you ready to share what you think people should do moving forward in regard to voting and suffrage? Great. Lucy, do you want to start?
Sure. I think something that's important to remember always is that voter suppression is a modern issue, and it looks like so many different things. It's in our society in so many different ways. So one thing that I would urge people to do during this election season is to hold your election board accountable. If you are going to vote by mail, make sure that you are requesting your ballot early, and if anything is weird, you should report that. Don't be afraid to report things. If you go to your polling place and something is weird, or you see something that doesn't sit right with you, don't be afraid to report that. And then also, just because it's a pandemic and a lot of the poll workers are of an at-risk group, I would recommend volunteering to work at the polls to fill a lot of spots that would have been filled by people who are needing to stay home during this time because they're more vulnerable. So volunteer and then report anything that's fishy.
Great, thank you. Alma?
Sure, I'm just gonna restate everything I kind of talked about. As students, we are privileged. We have the position to educate ourselves on issues. So go out, educate yourself on things that are important to you, and vote wisely. Vote in elections, get people around you to vote. And then in terms of women's suffrage, just know and celebrate your place as a woman in society, and know that you're important and that you have your voice that needs to be heard.
I love that, thank you. Lauren?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of going off of Lucy, know that depending on who you are, where you are, what your politicians are, they're working to suppress you, and make sure you know how to get around that, that you're prepared to get around that, and take some friends with you along the way while you're doing that. Make sure that they know what's up, how to vote, how to get through this process together. And yeah, just vote, exercise your right. It's important.
Awesome, thank you. Cassidy?
Yeah, once again, I would encourage everyone to listen to Anita Morgan's talk on Wednesday. It's going to be really, really fun. Also, if you'd like to get involved with the Big Ten Voting Challenge, there are many opportunities for you to do so. Would highly recommend that. And then for everyone, just have conversations with your family and friends. Are they planning on voting? How do they feel about voting by mail versus in person? Having these conversations can normalize specific fears and issues that people have, and encourage more people to register and actually vote this November.
Great, thank you. Sam?
Yeah, to echo a lot of the things that have already been said, vote, talk about the vote, bring other people to vote. If you're from a privileged situation, donate to organizations that are helping to fight for access to the vote, or volunteer your time if you have it. Yeah, all of the above.
Awesome, thank you. And there you have it, a bunch of amazing recommendations to be a civic individual moving forward. Thank you all again so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and this was really fun. And also thank you to everyone who tuned in out there. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your Monday.
Bye.